Fidelity high, the people you dig, the records they love.
John Dwyer is a critically acclaimed musician, visual artist, and frontman of OCs. Over the past 20 years, the prolific songwriter has released countless singles as well as 20 full-length albums under the OCs and OCS monikers. He has released solo albums as Damaged Bug and is a former member of the bands Coach Whips and Pink and Brown. He is also the co-owner of the popular independent label Castleface Records, who have issued recordings by Ty Segall, King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard, Kelly Stoltz, White Fence, Flatworms, and more.
This is John Dwyer of OCs, and my Fidelity high is Die Grün Ries, The Green Journey by A.R. and Machines. I was probably rolling around on the internet, and I kind of get on these rabbit holes where I'm trying to find an old record, and then a lot of times things will suggest other things, and there's a really fantastic website that I go to find out about old krautrock stuff in particular. And this record was up there, and it was just listed as, if you dig this stuff, you might dig this. And there's links to YouTube. And I found that they reissued a couple of his earlier albums. The guy's name is, I think you say it, Achim Reichel, something like that, German. But yeah, I started digging through his stuff, and then a lot of the later material is actually really hard to find. Or his stuff in the 80s is easy to find, but not so much my cup of tea. So these first 5 records are what interested me the most, the A.R. and Machines albums. I think what happened was I got on the kick of this band called Birth Control, who you might know, who were a German prog rock band. Crowdy, but 70s. Basically, I started getting all this 70s stuff, later, mid and later 70s, even up into the 80s. People like Michael Rother and stuff like that, just getting into when people were doing these, all these German studios were producing this great analog recordings, and it was really copious at the time too, tons of people, tons of record came out, Brain Records put out those Birth Control records, so I started digging into their catalog, which brought me to this website initially. And basically everything on that label I love. It's crazy. I mean, there's a few things here and there that I'm not super crazy about, but man, it's really tough when I'm going through the whole roster of that label trying to find these records, and some of them are $500 and $600, and you're well, I guess I'm not going to buy that. But it's just listening to these is totally inspiring. And this particular record, the A.R. and Machines, which I've also seen listed online as A.R. versus Machines, and I think the name supposedly of at least the first record derives from, and there's not too much on the internet about this guy, honestly. I dug around, and he made a lot, and he was on German television a bit, playing, rock stuff in the 80s more, but really there's not all that much out there about him, considering how deep, the internet goes. It's surprisingly 2 pages in, you start to lose him on, search engines. But this record is just this guy alone in the studio, sort of up against all the machines in the studio. So it's him working with tape echoes, guitars, drums, the recording devices. And it's, sort of it chimed with me because that's kind of what I do at home with Damaged Bug, I guess. It was sort of looking for inspiration for this other band that I do, which is just me usually at home, mostly alone. I'll bring in ringer drummers sometimes, but for the most part, even I'll play drums on it, or, it's just me at home sort of relaxing in a very relaxed environment, recording by myself. And his effort is pretty Herculean in this first record, because it's totally, I don't know, it's the riff that starts the record is really what grabbed me right away, because some of these records take a minute, they're they take a second to sink in, or they grow a bit as the record goes on and you start to like it. This record grabbed me right away. It has this guitar lick that comes in that sounds so tapey and so cool, a sound-on-sound echoplex loop of just a really random guitar invention, improvisational moment just captured perfectly. And I feel like he just did something and then immediately ran with it, and it just worked really well. And if it really is him playing everything on this record, it's pretty accomplished, because all the playing is pretty tight, and the record sort of covers a pretty broad spectrum of sounds from that time in Germany, from the psychedelic rock scene or the repetitive kraut motoric stuff it's pretty impressive to me. Like I like his later records too, but this one record was the one. That's I think why it's been reissued. I'm sure it has the same effect on other people that have heard it. But it is kind of a deep cut. There's not too much out there about this guy, and I had never heard of him until I randomly was pointed to him by this website.
Achim Reichel was the original singer and guitarist for the German rock and roll band The Rattles. Formed in Hamburg, the band have often been referred to as the German Beatles. Between 1963 and 65, The Rattles would issue 3 live albums recorded at the Star Club, the final venue the Beatles often performed at during the end of their period spent in Hamburg, which led to their first recordings as a band. The Rattles would support the Beatles during their final European tour in 1966. Reichel would leave the group that year and form the psychedelic rock outfit, the Wonderland Band. He would release his first solo album as AR and Machines in 1971, displaying a significant stylistic shift from his rock and roll beginnings.
From what I understand, the band like abruptly ended when he was drafted. Like it looked like some sort of a bit of a legal battle. I mean, again, I'm just going from what I read on one of his websites, because I did do a little research, but it looked like the band was just done when he got pulled in the army. And then when he came back, he had sort of reinvented himself and started a band called Wonderland. And it's also, it just gets a little, every time he returns with a new project, it gets a little bit more out there. Each time, even after AR and Machines, his projects got kind of weirder and weirder, and he sort of lost me after that band, but it got pretty weird until it suddenly turned on a dime and got poppy again, you know? He's an interesting guy. Though I know he ended up pulling a band on the later AR and Machines records, which were just simply listed as like AR3 or AR4, but AR5, but even shortened down without the Machines, so I think that after... maybe he wasn't working with... I think he was working with a band then, so he had maybe changed up the deal titular-wise, which I could totally get down with. I love it when people change their name, as is obvious on my end. But, I wish... I know the guy's still around, I think. I think he's out still playing, you know? He's still doing stuff. His website seems like it's only from a couple of years ago that it was updated. He's an interesting cat.
The Green Journey was released in 1971 in Germany only by the major label Polydor. It is cinematic in scope, and the back cover art includes a notation that it is a soundtrack to an intended motion picture.
Yeah, I think it's definitely pretty cinematic at points. There's big stretches of it that I would say are pretty, instrumental, which people, myself included, automatically lean towards the possibility that it could be used as like a audio aid to something you're watching. But I don't know. He's got a little bit of a mystery about him, I guess. He's definitely like got the artist vibe. Yeah, I think that could be bullshit. Who knows? I don't know. I actually hadn't read that, so that's the first time. And I own the record. I didn't see that on the back there, so that's the first time hearing that. But yeah, that's interesting to me. Why not? I'm pro faux soundtrack. It's been done before, and I think it's a great idea. It always makes me want to make the movie for the record if I like it that much, you know?
Beginning in the late 1960s, German groups started to deviate from standard rock and roll structures. Often referencing psych and jazz and frequently utilizing the motoric beat, they became much more experimental and at times shifted towards the avant-garde. Pioneers of the genre that would soon be dubbed as krautrock were Can, Neu, Faust, Tangerine Dream, and Kraftwerk, among others. While many categorized under the movement have cemented their place in music history, a significant amount of groups never broke through to popular culture. Much like the grunge movement in the 1990s, many of these artists dismissed the krautrock classification, though the genre had a significant and lasting impact. Their musical foundation and influence could still be heard in the decades to follow, with ESG in the early 80s, the work of Stereolab in the 90s, and today in artists such as LCD Sound System and John Dwyer's OCs, OCS, and Damage Bug recordings.
I'd say that back then, even though the States and England were experimenting with more forward-thinking kinds of music, as far as like psychedelic rock goes or whatever radio music was then, things were changing really rapidly. But nothing beats Europe for how much more they embrace things that we were kind of throwing away, like Free jazz, for instance, is a perfect example. I'd say there's like labels in Europe like ECM and XUL that were embracing all these artists like shit, man. There's so many black jazz musicians I can think of, like Sun Ra or Jack DeJohnette, for instance, did a ton of records with this. I think ECM's a German label, and it's another, forgive me if I'm wrong, but it's another one of these amazing studios that's running these like big two-inch tape machines with this amazing sounding room and all these killer engineers. They're just producing these amazing records that you can find for like $5. It's still like nobody gives a shit. But they really embraced all these kinds of music. And I think this is sort of this guy, a lot of these musics, not so much this guy, I guess, but like a lot of the Brain label records and stuff that I started digging into that's a little bit later 70s is really almost like the post version of what krautrock had laid out the path for, it's expanding more into like electronic music and weird, like sort of inverted pop music almost, like bands like La Dusseldorf, which came out of Neu, got really focused on this like weird like Hollywood landscape pop music. It's really cool and interesting, but they were embracing a lot more weirdness, and that was, I think, a little bit more on the mainstream. Now, as to why we don't hear about this stuff over here in the States, but we hear about bands like, obviously Can and Neu. Can is probably going to be my favorite band of all time. I just still listen to them. Malcolm Mooney, Damo Suzuki have been such massive inspirations. Jack Liebzeit's drumming he's still my favorite drummer in the world out of all the drummers I love. But they stand out because they're exceptional. They made pop, but they also experimented constantly. Their records were like a total mishmash of all kinds of stuff, but they were like the one that got away and got out into the world, whereas these smaller bands, it's like in America, I feel like maybe a little bit less now with the internet, but back in the day, bands, like even Canadian bands, had a hard time breaking out here, Like, look at Rush probably had this they're a Canadian band, they had this like massive uphill battle, so can you imagine coming all the way from Europe? Like, people didn't know anybody. Like, there's like all these people that were huge over in Europe, like Jacques Brel or whatever, that nobody's ever heard of over here. They weren't getting played on the radio, and this is how people back in the day found out about music was, either word of mouth or on the radio, I would assume, or television. So it's pretty far out. But Germany was definitely at the forefront of like just artistic allowment. Like I don't even know if that's a real word, but you know what I mean. Like everybody was really open-minded. I think it probably has a lot to do with just like, the summer of love and like after, the fall of the Reich, like all this art comes out of like all these like crazy tragedies and stuff. So it's just a really interesting time in Germany. The list goes on and on and on of all these bands that were working in the late 60s and 70s up through the 80s that made killer shit. And a lot of it is, hard to find, and these records will be $500, but sometimes you can find these records for like $20, $30 in the original pressings because, again, nobody cares, or it's like such a niche thing, you know what I mean? I could talk about Can all day. They are a band that I've read a book about. I haven't read too many books about musicians. It's not a thing I do so much, but I've read about Miles Davis. I've read about the Zombies. I've read about Can, just because they're bands that inspired me hugely when I was young. But Can, to me, I feel like people kind of already know about them. They're in movies now. I don't want to say obvious because that's obnoxious, but I felt like if I'm going to do something like this with you, I want it to be like an interesting record that somebody might want to explore it. For God's sake, if you haven't heard Can, fucking go out and listen to Can because they're the band. They're not the band that made me love music, but they're the band that made me want to make music. And it took me 20 years to even, put a ripple on the surface of what I heard in my ears and in my brain when I heard that band, like to be able to go as deep as they did, in my opinion, and not, it's just, it took me a long time to be comfortable enough to emulate small portions. I could never compare myself to them, but you know what I mean? It's like, I wear them on my sleeve, and it's just a band. Like I probably own more stuff by them than anybody else because there's been so many bootlegs and there's so much great shit. And some of these guys are still around. They're slowly dying off, all of our heroes. But I'm glad that there's an interest peaked in this band because it's made my life better. But I just didn't pick them because I wanted to go deep. Just the factor, like I think with him, what really struck me too is a lot of it is so much loop based guitar playing where he'll be playing over himself and then again and again and again. And like compiling this pile of guitars. There's like, there'll be like 8 guitars going at once suddenly, and it's just him playing drums with himself, essentially. On like I'm assuming it's going to be a tape machine with sound on sound where he's just like looping himself over and over again. But that's an interesting approach that wasn't, I don't hear that too much in a lot of music back then. Even though this tool was available, not too many people used it, and he uses it like the hell out of it on all of these AR Machines records and the AR 2, 3, and 4, or 3, 4, and 5 rather. I actually just this year got into looping. It was never something I was interested in, but then I realized with lacking another guitar player, for instance, live, I do a lot of doubled up guitar harmonies on the record, so there'll be like a shreddy part, and then it'll be layered with another guitar that sort of harmonizes with it for like, for solo or lead stuff. And although I haven't really been able to emulate what I do on the record live without another guitar player, I can sort of step into those zones a little bit with just simple like 5-second looping capabilities for like more improvisational stuff. But it's pretty neat and fun, and getting like these sort of like hypnotic patterns going and repetition. I'm really into repetition, and not because it's simple, but because of like the hypno quality of these musics, like having a drummer. I'm all about bass and drums just holding down the fort for like 15-20 minutes while everybody else in the band can explore and sort of slowly, like even like you hear bands like or composers like Steve Reich, I'm not sure how you say his last name, but he would do things like would deconstruct one chord between 4 organs that would slowly pull apart until it was like this whole progression, and then slowly grow back together again. Like that's all these things, This material is sort of in the moment, it's like an immediate satisfaction kind of thing. Like he was recording this record, and that was it. It was a take, and it was done, and it was like really cool. It's not like it's like a recorded improvisation. It's not necessarily to be repeated over and over again live like some things are. So it's just from that side of the fence in my mind that the difference between Can did a lot of improvisation too, but this guy's record is just something else in its entirety, I think. Eno supposedly was a fan and said that this record, being The Green Journey, was inspiration for his record Another Green World, which is pretty far out because that record's an incredible piece of work as well. To inspire Eno as a young man is pretty cool. I think maybe this guy was cursed to be a musician's musician. You know what I mean? Like that's another reason maybe why we haven't heard him, is because the people that like him are his contemporaries and bands. You know what I mean? It's not necessarily just out in the public for some reason.
Thank you to John Dwyer of OCs, and thank you for listening to this episode of Fidelity High. All Fidelity High episodes to date can be found at iTunes and fidelityhigh.com.